On an afternoon in late 2002, amid the bustling atmosphere of Changi Airport, a sharp alarm rang out at Gate C-22, drawing the full attention of security officers toward a young, Asian-looking man. From the outside, he appeared no different from any other passenger, yet just one touch to his lower back was enough for an officer to sense that something had been carefully concealed on his body. So who was he? Why was he traveling alone while carrying enough contraband for 26,000 doses, an amount that could earn him the death penalty from the very first moment? And what could drive a young man with no prior criminal record to push himself into a path with no way out? The story you are about to hear is not simply about heroin trafficking. It is a tragedy of family ties, desperation, innocence, and split-second decisions that exact the ultimate price. Please note that all content in today's video has been researched and compiled from various sources. If you notice any point that needs correction or clarification, feel free to leave a comment below so we can update it promptly. If you find this story thought-provoking, please share the video to spread it further. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Vietnamese Case Files so we know you enjoy these gripping investigative stories. On the afternoon of December 12, 2002, Gate C-22 of Changi Airport's Terminal 1 remained as lively as usual. Among the passengers was a young Asian-faced man making a transit stop before boarding Qantas flight QF10 to Melbourne, scheduled to depart at 8:15 p.m. As he passed through the security checkpoint at around 7:45 p.m., the alarm suddenly went off. A female security officer approached with a handheld scanner, sweeping it across his body but finding no metal object. However, when she touched the lower back of the passenger, she immediately felt an unusual bulge beneath his clothing. Remaining calm, she asked, "What is this?" The passenger, visibly startled, shook his head and said, "No." Sensing clear suspicion, the security team escorted the man to an inspection room and confiscated his backpack and carry-on bag. Inside the private screening room, a male officer instructed Van to raise his hands against the wall for a body check. Surprisingly, he did not resist, he fully cooperated. He slowly lifted his shirt and turned around, revealing a large plastic bundle tightly wrapped with yellow and white tape strapped to his lower back. When asked, "What is this?" the man bowed his head and admitted, "Heroin, sir." Moments later, he burst into tears and attempted to bang his head against the wall in panic. Officers tried to help him calm down. A few minutes later, once he regained control, one officer asked whether he had anything else in his luggage. Without hesitation, the man said yes, retrieved another plastic bundle from his backpack, and handed it over. His cooperation left officers both stunned and somewhat sympathetic toward his unusual behavior. Unlike many hardened traffickers, this young man, after his initial panic, voluntarily surrendered all contraband. Immediately after, airport security notified the Airport Drug Enforcement Team of Singapore's Central Narcotics Bureau, CNB. CNB officers arrived at 9:10 p.m. and took over the scene and evidence. The two powder-filled bundles were sealed and sent for analysis. Each one measured around 3 to 4 centimeters thick, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and tightly sealed with yellow tape. Laboratory analysis revealed that the packages contained a total of 396.2 grams of pure heroin, about 151.5 grams in the bundle taped to his back, and 244.7 grams in the bundle inside the backpack. Although this amount was roughly equivalent to the weight of a single soda can, it could produce 26,000 doses of illegal drugs, 26 times higher than Singapore's 15-gram threshold for the death penalty. With such a shocking discovery, the veteran officers at the airport knew the young man's legal fate was almost sealed. Yet his behavior puzzled them. Instead of denying his crime or attempting to conceal the evidence, he voluntarily surrendered the drugs and fully cooperated. He continued crying uncontrollably and fell into complete distress the moment he was arrested, showing none of the hardened traits of an experienced trafficker. Regardless, the criminal case was formally opened. The passenger was handcuffed and escorted to CNB headquarters at the Central Police Station for interrogation that same night. From the identification documents he carried, police learned that he was Tuong Nguyen, an Australian citizen of Vietnamese origin born in 1980 with no prior criminal history. Still, his motive and the circumstances leading to such a reckless act remained a major question, much like the mystery behind the two taped bundles of white powder seized from him. At the station, when officers examined Van's backpack and bag, they found a stash of items, including 9 counterfeit wristwatches, mimicking luxury brands, and 10 brand new leather belts. Van explained that these were souvenirs he had bought in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, to give to friends as Christmas gifts. He also carried 2 mobile phones, a Nokia and a Siemens, along with a Sony laptop borrowed from a friend. On his person, police collected loose currency totaling roughly $100 consisting of Cambodian, Vietnamese, Singaporean, Australian, and US money, likely leftover spending cash from his trip. Notably, in his wallet was a small slip of paper with a phone number in Australia beginning with +04, matching the number Van identified as belonging to the mastermind who had drawn him into the scheme. Investigators quickly traced Van's travel history. He had entered Singapore on December 6, 2002 on a flight from Phnom Penh and was scheduled to fly onward to Melbourne on December 12th. This meant Van had spent about a week in Cambodia. At the airport, he was alone, with no accomplice in sight. This raised 2 possibilities. Either Van was a lone courier working for an international smuggling network, or he was acting entirely on his own. Remaining cooperative, Van said that a man named Sun had contacted him by phone and hired him to take the packages to Melbourne. Remarkably, Van did not know who the recipient would be. Sun told him that the contact would recognize Van first and initiate the exchange using the phrase, "I like basketball." So, did Van know he was carrying illegal drugs? The answer was yes, though he said he could not distinguish the type because he had never used drugs himself. And the reason he became entangled in this scheme was heartbreaking. Van told investigators he had a twin brother named Nguyen Koa in Melbourne, and it was Koa who pushed him into this desperate situation. More importantly, a few years earlier, Koa had faced criminal charges for drug possession and assault, leaving him with heavy legal fees and debts. Out of love for his brother, Van dropped out of university to work and pay for Koa's legal costs. But before the old debts were resolved, Koa accumulated new debts with organized crime, leading both brothers to be threatened by gangsters. Under that pressure, Van made the desperate decision to accept a drug courier job to earn money and save his brother. This information made even the most seasoned investigators pause, as it appeared that Nguyen Tuong Van was both a perpetrator and a victim, driven by love for his family and reckless desperation. Knowing Van's family was struggling financially, a man named Tan in Melbourne introduced him to a quick money job in November 2002. At first, Van did not know what the job was. He only vaguely heard that he would need to travel overseas. Later, in Sydney, a man named Sun made a direct offer to hire Van to transport heroin from Asia to Australia for a very large payout. Desperate and needing money to pay his brother's debts, Van agreed, unable to grasp the full consequences he would face. Sun then arranged Van's round-trip airfare from Australia to Cambodia, covered his hotel expenses, and gave him $1,000 up front as spending money. On December 3, 2002, Van departed Sydney, transited through Singapore, and flew to Phnom Penh. There, he received 2 packages of heroin, one strapped to his lower back and the other hidden in his backpack, before preparing to return to Australia via Singapore. Van admitted that he was terrified, but the traffickers had threatened to harm his family in Melbourne if he failed or ran off with the drugs. When arrested at Changi Airport, Van said he feared for his family's safety, yet also felt strangely relieved that he no longer had to continue committing the crime. These sincere statements offered the first glimpses of a young man trapped between debt, threats, and the lure of quick cash. However, confessions alone were insufficient. Police needed independent verification. Digital forensics experts were brought in to extract data from Van's 2 mobile phones and borrowed Sony laptop. The results showed that apart from a mysterious text, "checked out now," sent to Van on December 3rd, there was nothing suspicious. The number was traced to a prepaid Australian SIM, likely used and discarded by Sun, making it impossible to identify him. Singaporean police then worked with the Australian Federal Police to investigate the 2 figures known as Sun and Tan, but with such limited information, both remained ghost-like. Changi Airport's CCTV footage was reviewed and confirmed Van was traveling alone, with no escort or helper. This strengthened the theory that he was merely a lone courier. In Van's travel timeline, only one person had contact with him, his Singaporean friend, Golgan, who met him during transit on December 3rd while Van was on his way to Cambodia. During questioning, Golgan confirmed they only made casual conversation and that he knew nothing about the drug operation. Thus, no witness or accomplice could help uncover a larger network. Because the suspect was a foreign citizen, Singapore was obligated to follow Article 36 of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, meaning the Australian embassy or consulate had to be notified of his arrest and allowed access to him as soon as possible. But in reality, Van had been interrogated throughout the night of December 12th and the day of December 13th, while the Australian side was only notified in the late afternoon of December 13th. Van's defense later argued that the delay in consular access violated procedure, but the court dismissed this claim, stating that consular rights were granted before the investigation concluded and that all of Van's statements had been made voluntarily. Across 4 recorded statements, Van clearly described the events, from meeting Tan to receiving the drugs and being arrested. His statements were consistent and logically coherent, and the court accepted them as a full confession under Singapore's evidentiary rules. Notably, in the statement dated December 19, 2002, Van expressed deep remorse and admitted all elements of the offense. As for further investigation, Singaporean authorities collaborated with Australian police, but could not arrest anyone else. Sun remained an unidentified phantom, and although authorities checked for a man named Tan in Melbourne, no actionable leads were found. There were indications that Australian police once considered the option of setting up a sting operation by asking Singapore to release Van so he could continue his journey, allowing authorities to follow him to the recipient in Melbourne and capture the entire network. However, Singapore firmly refused, unwilling to gamble national security on such an experiment. Furthermore, Singaporean law at the time imposed a mandatory death sentence for trafficking large quantities of illegal drugs, leaving no mechanism for sentence reduction in exchange for cooperation. In fact, the court acknowledged that Van had cooperated extensively, providing all information and contact numbers linked to the case, but existing law simply did not allow for a lighter sentence based solely on that. In March 2004, the case went to trial before the High Court of Singapore. Proceedings were swift because the defendant had already pleaded guilty. Van was represented by defense lawyer Joseph Thasaira and assistant Tito Isaac, while 2 deputy public prosecutors represented the state. In court, Van appeared calm, though resigned. He confirmed that he had carried 396 grams of heroin through the airport, but lawyer Thasaira immediately presented 3 main arguments in his defense. First, he argued that the mandatory death penalty under Singapore's Misuse of Drugs Act was unconstitutional, conflicting with Article 9, Right to Life, and Article 12, Right to Equal Protection, of the Singapore Constitution. They contended that an inflexible punishment that ignored all mitigating circumstances amounted to a cruel and arbitrary deprivation of life. However, the panel of judges, led by Chief Justice Yong Pung Hao, rejected this argument, citing legal precedent that mandatory capital punishment did not violate the Constitution and had been clearly established by Parliament. Second, the defense argued that Van's statements during the investigation might not have been entirely voluntary because he was not granted early consular access. They referenced the Vienna Convention and requested the court to exclude some statements made before the Australian consul met Van on the afternoon of December 13th. However, Justice Kan Ting Chiu ruled that there had been no serious violation. He reasoned that even if consular notification had been delayed by 20 hours, this did not render the statements coerced or unreliable. In reality, Van had signed each page of his statements, and even his defense lawyer admitted that police had not threatened or mistreated him during questioning. Third, the defense focused on Van's unique circumstances, that he was a first-time courier pressured into the role and not acting for personal profit. They hoped the court would consider humanitarian factors in seeking leniency. The lawyer also submitted multiple letters requesting clemency from Van's family, friends, and even a church bishop. However, Justice Kan Ting Chiu firmly stated that the law did not allow personal circumstances to be considered for this offense. He explained that anyone caught importing more than 15 grams of heroin into Singapore faced only one possible punishment: death. In other words, the court's job was merely to determine whether the accused had committed the crime. Once guilt was established, the death sentence was mandatory. Thus, on March 20th, 2004, the court convicted Nguyen Tuong Van of importing 396.2 grams of heroin and sentenced him to death. When the verdict was read, Van remained silent, showing little emotion except for the redness in his eyes. He seemed mentally prepared for this moment. He then turned toward his crying mother and nodded gently, as if trying to comfort her. Legally, the death sentence was unsurprising, as it was a statutory requirement. But it marked the beginning of a long battle for his family and the Australian government to try to save his life. Van immediately filed an appeal to the Court of Appeal of Singapore. On October 20th, 2004, the appeal was heard by a panel of 3 senior judges. Lawyer Thazaira continued to argue on constitutional and procedural grounds, hoping to overturn the sentence. He cited international law and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the court responded that international norms could not override domestic law. Regarding the constitutionality of mandatory capital punishment, the Court of Appeal maintained its position that no violation existed. Thus, in its decision on October 21st, 2004, the court upheld the death sentence for Nguyen Tuong Van, affirming that Singaporean law did not allow judges to consider humanitarian factors in such cases. With all domestic legal avenues closed, the unfortunate young man had no remaining options in Singapore. Yet outside, Van's family and the Australian government continued fighting until the very last moment. In January 2005, both the Governor-General of Australia and the Australian Prime Minister sent letters requesting clemency for Van to Singapore's President Selapan Nathan. In February 2005, Australian Prime Minister John Howard personally met Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong on the sidelines of a regional summit and brought up Van's case. Howard later recounted that he had told Singapore directly that the Australian public cared deeply about the matter and hoped the Singaporean government would consider humanitarian grounds. But Prime Minister Lee responded only that the case was being reviewed carefully at all levels. In reality, Singapore's cabinet had held several sessions to discuss Nguyen Tuong Van's clemency request. Under Singapore's procedure, ministers deliberate and then advise the president. Media reports stated that although Singapore sympathized with Van's circumstances, they feared setting a dangerous precedent if they showed leniency toward foreign drug offenders. Singapore also faced internal pressure, as a large majority of its citizens supported the death penalty for drug trafficking and did not want the government to appear lenient under foreign political pressure. As a result, all efforts gradually became futile. On October 21, 2005, Singapore's Ministry of Home Affairs issued an official letter denying Nguyen Tuong Van's clemency petition. Van's family in Melbourne was devastated by the news. Australian Prime Minister John Howard somberly stated on television that this was a stark reminder of how harsh Asian drug laws could be. He affirmed that the Australian government had done everything within its power, but Singapore maintained a firm stance. On November 17, 2005, Van's family received another letter from Singapore informing them that the execution date had been set for December 2, 2005. This meant that the condemned prisoner had less than half a month left to live. His mother, Kim Nguyen, and his twin brother, Koa, immediately flew to Singapore. They brought religious images and numerous letters from relatives. Upon seeing her son in prison, Mrs. Kim collapsed in tears, begging to take his place. But after nearly 3 years behind bars, Van had found composure and instead became a source of strength for his mother. In his final days, he joined Catholic catechism classes in prison, was baptized, and received the Christian name Caleb. Priests stated that Van had found peace in his faith, repeatedly encouraging his mother to stay strong so he could leave without regret. Meanwhile, public opinion in Australia remained deeply divided. A nationwide poll showed that 47% of Australians supported carrying out the execution, while 46% opposed it. One side believed Singapore's laws had to be respected. The other argued that the death penalty was inhumane. Tensions rose sharply, especially within the Vietnamese community and among Catholic groups who organized large prayer campaigns for Van. Some groups even called for protests and boycotts against Singapore Airlines and the Optus Telecommunications Company, reflecting the anger among parts of the Australian public. The Australian government found itself caught between domestic pressure and diplomatic relations, but ultimately reaffirmed that it would not retaliate against Singapore, prioritizing stable bilateral ties above all. During the final week of November 2005, Mrs. Kim and Koa were allowed to visit Van twice a day, each visit lasting 1 hour. Nguyen Tuong Van appeared strangely optimistic and strong. Lawyer Lex Lazary, after visiting him on November 19th, recounted that Van was courageous, positive, and more concerned for others than for himself. Van asked his lawyer to convey his gratitude to those supporting him back home and reminded Koa to live well for both of them. On November 26th, Prime Minister Howard also met privately with Van's mother to comfort her and listen to the family's final wishes. The last request made by the Australian side was to allow Van's mother to embrace him one last time before the execution. Under Changi prison regulations, all physical contact with death row inmates was strictly prohibited. Visits were conducted only through a glass partition. However, this being an exceptional case, internal debate ensued. On November 29th and 30th of 2005, Singapore's High Commissioner to Australia, Joseph Koh, repeatedly appeared on Australian media to explain Singapore's position. He said he was deeply moved by the mother's grief, but emphasized that the law must be applied equally to both foreigners and Singaporean citizens. He stressed that this strictness had saved countless families from the devastation caused by illegal drugs, and expressed hope that Australians would respect Singapore's legislative sovereignty. Regarding the final contact request, Mr. Koh said the Singaporean government had considered it on humanitarian grounds. On the afternoon of December 1st, 2005, Singapore announced that Nguyen Tuong Van would be allowed to hold hands with his mother and brother one last time. Although an embrace was not permitted, the permission to hold hands was an unprecedented exception in the country's history. That night, the final night before the execution, soft candlelight appeared outside Changi prison. A small group of young people and several Singaporean activists stood at a distance, holding candles in silent prayer for Van. At the same time, in major churches across Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra, thousands of Australians gathered to hold candlelight vigils. Outside Australia's Parliament House in Canberra, hundreds held signs bearing anguished questions directed at Singapore. At dawn on December 2nd, 2005, the sky over Singapore was still dark. In his death row cell, Nguyen Tuong Van awoke at 5 in the morning. He washed himself carefully and put on the nicest clothes his family had sent him for one final photograph. He was then escorted down the cold corridors of the death row wing. Walking beside him were lawyer Julian McMahon and his brother Kwa, who could not enter the execution chamber but were permitted to follow him up to its door. Koa struggled to hold back tears, whispering prayers under his breath. At exactly 6 o'clock, Nguyen Tuong Van was taken into the execution chamber. The room fell silent as the officer in charge asked him for his final words. Van took a deep breath and clearly said that he apologized to his mother and family, thanked the Australian government and everyone who had tried to help him, and asked God for forgiveness. His voice trembled. After that, the procedures proceeded as scheduled. Van's time of death was recorded as 6:06 a.m. on December 2nd, 2005. After the execution, the body of Nguyen Tuong Van was lowered and handed over to the authorities. In an unexpected and rare humanitarian gesture, Singapore allowed Mrs. Kim Nguyen to see her son one final time before the body was taken away. Lawyer Julian McMahon recalled with emotion that she was permitted to touch his face and stroke his hair one last time, which brought her immense comfort. Perhaps the prison wished to ease the pain of a mother enduring unimaginable loss. At 7:17 in the morning, the prison doctor signed the certificate confirming that Nguyen Tuong Van had passed away. As dawn broke over Singapore, it marked the end of that fateful Friday morning. News of Van's execution quickly spread across the world. In Melbourne, the bells of St. Ignatius Church rang 25 times, each toll symbolizing a year of his life. Hundreds attending the service broke into tears. The presiding priest said that the congregation was praying not only for the soul of Caleb, Van's baptismal name, but also for those who had to make the decision to carry out the sentence. In Canberra, the flag atop Parliament House was lowered to half-mast in remembrance. Prime Minister John Howard, his eyes visibly red, told the press that it was a sad day and that he hoped young Australians would learn a vital lesson: never become involved with illicit substances, not even once. In reality, the Australian government treated the case of Nguyen Tuong Van as a powerful warning to its citizens about the severe consequences of drug-related crimes in Asia. On Singapore's side, the aftermath of this case also forced lawmakers to reconsider their approach. By the year 2012, Singapore officially passed legal amendments, allowing courts to impose life imprisonment instead of mandatory death sentences for drug couriers acting merely as mules, provided they cooperated with investigations or suffered from mental disorders. In other words, starting from the year 2013, judges were able to spare individuals in situations similar to that of Nguyen Tuong Van from the death penalty. Unfortunately, this change came too late for him. Nevertheless, it became a form of indirect legacy of his case, helping save the lives of others in later years. In fact, another well-known death row inmate, Yang Vui Kong from Malaysia, arrested in the year 2007 for trafficking heroin, benefited from the new law, and had his sentence reduced to life imprisonment in the year 2013, narrowly escaping death. And what about you? What do you think about the controversial death sentence in this case? Should such a rigid punishment exist even when the offender has shown remorse and cooperated fully? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And before you go, please like, share this video, and subscribe to Vietnamese Case Files to support us. For now, goodbye, and see you in the next shocking case.